Welcome back to the second part of Navigating Fixed Recoverable Costs, featuring costs expert and special guest, Sean Linley. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, we recommend starting there, but you're also more than welcome to dive straight into this episode.
One of the other things that we said that we were going to touch on was looking ahead 5 or 10 years. And I guess the question is, we've been talking about how do we deal with some of these very difficult problems, and we don't have it. We've captured the answer in the simple term technology without necessarily drilling down into precisely what that means. In terms of costs, industries, is cost draftsman going to exist in 5 or 10 years as a title, or is it going to be obsolete? You've referenced how actually the financial challenges are going to make it so that either you're going to have potentially these massive kind of factory firms running litigation, or you're going to have solicitors have to become kind of actuarial level sophistication in terms of running their practice. What's going to happen to the cost draftsman in the next 5 or 10 years? How do you see their role changing, technology changing? How do you think about that?
It's a really interesting question, and I'd start by going back to when I started out in costs. I think it was 2012, and it was just on the eve of the last SPO reforms. And for those who remember it, it basically saw the abolishment of recoverability of additional liabilities in most litigation. And there's obviously still the odd exception, that's clinical negligence and mesothelioma, that still sit there. But broadly speaking, I remember back then you had kind of fixed costs was just kind of coming in as kind of a new thing on low value RTA cases, and everyone was sort of saying, well, 5-10 years there'll be no cost draftsman, there'll be no cost lawyers, there'll be no space for cost professionals. And actually what's happened, I think, is that although the volume of cases isn't as great, the cases that we deal with are more complicated and a lot more involved. So we saw things like the introduction of cost budgeting, which is it's got its fans and it's got its people who dislike it as well. But I think overall, I think the general consensus it works well. So I think that's a good starting point to say. Sort of 10 years ago, I came into an industry where there was a lot of people saying, over 10 years ago, I was coming into an industry where everyone was saying it was going to be falling away. And I think it would be naive of me if I was to sit here today to say in 5 to 10 years' time that everything will be the same. But I think as an industry, I think we're very resilient. I think that there's always going to be a need for us, but I think there is going to be a need to utilise technology more, because I think if you have firms who employ technology to make processes more efficient, then naturally it's going to give them a competitive advantage. It has to. So I think there is definitely a need to be able to utilise that. And I think where that kind of investment and where that kind of development is likely to be is probably actually in the aggregating of the data in the first place. But I think in terms of actually putting it into a usable format and the actual oversight of it, I think that's always going to be required. And in fact, we've seen in sort of recent weeks, there's a number of cases where I think there's one involving a junior barrister who'd used ChatGPT to get the references for the case law citations on one of her skeleton arguments, and transpired that some of those citation cases didn't actually exist. And then there was another solicitor who had their client had supplied them with some information which I think had come via ChatGPT, and again that had case citations that didn't exist. So there is still this need, I think, for oversight even within the technology. And I was listening to a really kind of interesting podcast a few weeks ago where they were talking about AI, and they were talking about AI right now as kind of being if you were looking at it on an evolutionary scale, AI right now is an amoeba. And whilst it took like thousands of years to get to dinosaurs. It might take 10 or 15, 20 years for AI to get to kind of the dinosaur point of evolution. So, moving at a much quicker speed. But I think there's still a lot that needs to be done. There's still always going to be, I think, a need for human interpretation on certain elements. And it's going to be a case of interpreting information more. And I think the other thing as well, which I know from past experience, was at one of my previous firms that I worked for, they invested in software where the idea was that the fee earners in the firm could categorize the work themselves. This is phasing and task codes and activity codes. And the idea is great practice, because the idea was that if the fee earners could record the work like that, it saves time, because we could literally then just look at it and go, right, we could see exactly where this is. So if you've got like a case where there's a cost budget, the idea was you could monitor it and see, is there going to be an overspend in this phase? But the reality is that whenever you're dealing with data, it's only as good as the people that are inputting it. And my experience is that on the whole, even where you have systems which are designed to be automated, they are not 100% infallible. And even where you had, where it would have suggested phases for kinds of work, didn't always get it right. And sometimes I remember I'd be looking at things going, oh, wow, it looks like you've really, really spent a lot on witness evidence. But then when I actually went away and looked into it, they actually had things like witness statements for applications. Now, the witness statements for the applications are different to witness statements. And you can see how these things easily get confused. But you need that oversight. So it's, again, I think even where we do make a great use of technology, and we've seen that already actually in the last few years. We've got electronic bill of costs now, although there's a lot of talk about whether that's working as well as it should, and maybe that will change. But, back when I started out, it was dictation. There was no software to actually produce the bills. I remember when we got the software to produce the bills, that makes a massive difference. It's not the software, not an automated process by any means, but going from having to kind of do everything yourself in a Word document to actually having software where you could input the information you needed and then the software pulls it out, it makes a massive difference. But I think wherever we've had those advancements, I just think there's too many kind of, too many grey areas effectively within the rules that we would be completely, removed from the process. But I think that you still, you've got to use technology, and we've got to use it to our advantage to make things, more efficient. And there's pressure on us, because obviously more cases in fixed costs, the fixed cost disputes, it's much the same for us as it is for the firms. Fixed cost cases don't recover the same level of recoverable costs in terms of the cost proceedings. So we've got to work smarter anyway in those cases, because we want to stay relevant, and we've got to be innovative in the way we do our work as well.
I mean, I wasn't seeking to make you redundant quite. I think the point was just, is your role and going to change, and how's it going to change? And the way we think about it is much the same as you've described there. Essentially what you want to do with technology is put an Iron Man suit on the lawyer or the draftsman. You want to make that person better at what they do. And I think there's always going to be human in the loop. But things are moving tremendously quickly as well. And the kinds of things that were not possible even 18 months ago suddenly now are a very real possibility. It's interesting to hear you talking about the hallucination. There's obviously a very celebrated case in the States where some of the case citations were hallucinated, and it's very embarrassing for the solicitor involved. So I'd be interested to see those cases. But I think you also need to be, as an organization, very careful about that as you go through your kind of tech journey. I guess we do a lot of training internally on how to use AI responsibly, and we have a project called Project Lighthouse, which essentially is trying to help all of our staff understand what the pitfalls are, and I think that's going to be part of every firm's journey with technology.
I think it's interesting as well from an access to justice point of view, because technology, I think we talked about before, how it does require a great investment, varying degrees. And it is interesting from, does that kind of technology, does it give an advantage within litigation actually to those who can afford that investment? And I don't mean that in the context of the law firms. I mean that in the context of the actual litigants themselves. And I think that's really interesting. And I don't know at what point we'll be able to sit back and judge that, but you can definitely foresee, different tiers of what's available to different people, because those who have the greater financial means are obviously going to be able to afford a different kind of representation to those who can't. And then that kind of then sort of full circles us back to fixed costs, which is it fixes costs between the parties. It doesn't fix the costs that the actual individuals can pay. So, if you want this really luxurious legal service, full team of King's Counsel and the most experienced London lawyers, you can do that. You have to pay for it, but you can do it. And then that then starts to lead to these questions of, is there an inequity of arms potentially? And that, I think that's really kind of interesting to kind of think about. And then also I think the other really interesting from a cost perspective with these sort of technology investments, which is then how does that sit with the hourly rate? And I mean that in multiple ways, because I think you and I, when we were in Bournemouth, were speaking about this notion of, if you invest in certain technologies which speed up, make things more efficient, and you've been charging on a time basis, and then suddenly you're going something that takes an hour, takes 6 minutes, but there's obviously an expense to investing in that technology, then how does that sit in terms of what you can recover? What's the value of that? Because there has to be a value to the investment. There has to be a recognition that, the technology isn't free. But then the idea will always be that if you're using technology to make things more efficient, that it would follow that has to cost less than the human doing it. Otherwise, it kind of negates the point of doing it. So you're in a strange situation where you could see these big investments, which probably won't pay dividends to begin with. But I think if you look at the amount of investment going into AI firms at the moment, you're not going to see that level of investment if they don't think there's going to be returns in the longer term. So it's kind of really interesting to see how the judiciary will deal with that as well, because they're going to have to get to grips and sort of say, well, actually, what do we allow for this work? And really interestingly, actually, I was reading a decision this week this week at the time of recording, a case involving Tata Steel. And it's a group litigation case. And one of the things that the judge was looking at was what's called mail merge. So this is, you use the software for the big mail shots of general correspondence that goes out to everyone. And effectively the decision came that the fees for these letters were claimed at 2-minute units as opposed to 6-minute units. And the judge said, well, that strikes me that's reasonable. And I think that's kind of really interesting, because you've gone from what maybe, if you go back 20 years ago, you might have been arguing for a 6-minute unit. Now the technology is there, it's only a 2-minute unit. So you can see that the cost of that work is being compressed down. You're still getting something for it, but it has come down. And I think that might almost be a bit of an insight into how the judiciary might deal with this in terms of other service areas as well, which is that you recover something for it, but you might find that actually it's at a bit of a lower level. And of course, when I was talking about the inequality of arms that technology can bring, actually these efficiencies might actually increase access to justice at the same time. So, there's always two sides to these things, but I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the cost side of it plays into the use of the technology, because we get the arguments all the time that we should be able to prepare bills at a push of a button. And I wish that was true, but it doesn't work like that. But that's the arguments we get now, and the technology is not really there to do that yet. But I guess the belief is at some point that will come in, and then of course that then leads to the questions, and then you've got the other questions about as well, more people working remotely, things like that. How does that affect? Because guideline hourly rates, which is, there's a starting point for most solicitor charges, basically are calculated by, you had a calculation of what the overhead is, and then an element that's profit. Obviously the overheads are kind of based presently largely on the idea that people are sitting in big offices. That's kind of not the same anymore. It's people are kind of dotted out. You can work for a London law firm in Barbados if you wanted to. You know, you could sit on the beach and do your job, which is amazing, really. But you've got a lot of these, but you've got a lot of these things where people think about technology in the sense of how does it alter the actual work you're doing, but it actually alters where you do the work, how you do the work. And we're seeing the Master of the Rolls really pushing hard on digitalisation of the courts. So, you know, it's all going to be really interesting to see how that then all feeds into the kind of the bigger picture, which is, you know, if overheads start to come down because the office spaces are becoming smaller, people working from home, so the overheads may be reduced. Does that mean that, you know, do hourly rates come down potentially? You know, there's all these sorts of things in the long distance future where lots of people always assume it's always an upwards trajectory, but you know, it's not possible. You know, it's possible it could go the other way.
Yeah, it could. Although, you know, it's not only the efficiency that's improved; it's also hopefully the quality. You know, I'm sure that you've experienced that over the last 10 years. The technology that's been introduced has made you faster, but it's also probably made you more accurate. And that should certainly be the case. The idea of how you charge, whether you charge for outcomes, whether you charge by consumption, whether we get some kind of tokenomics, that's all going to be very interesting to see.
Yeah, and it's worth, I think, just for some fixed costs there, because fixed costs are fixed. You know, to the cost that you're actually recovering, it doesn't make a difference, actually, the level of work you've done, providing, you know, your retainer is set up in the appropriate way. So in theory, like I was talking earlier about cases where I've had firms who actually had better outcomes through fixed costs as opposed to time-basis costs. And I'm not just that's going to happen for every case, but on a fixed cost, when you're thinking about these efficiencies and actually speeding things up and reducing the cost of certain things, and actually, you know, you could be not only just the quality, but you could be improving the outcome for the actual law firm potentially.
Yeah, I mean, we talk internally often about not just costs, but as you say, compressing timeframes. And, you know, you have to think about the kind of litigation that we're involved in. You've essentially most often got one person who's gone through the most sort of deranging 18 months of their lives. Something very tragic has gone wrong, whether or not it was a mistake. It's a very difficult period, and anyone who's been a solicitor or who's been through litigation knows how difficult that is. Certainly, going to trial is a trial in itself for the claimant, but the defendants and all of the people involved in the trusts are experiencing the same kind of derangement in their lives. And, you know, we always say internally to the team, the quicker that we can get to a fair outcome, whichever direction that is, the better for everyone. Because if you're a doctor who's been involved in this kind of case, then, you know, it essentially is going to take over your life for the duration of the case. So anything that we can do to compress timeframes, it's less expensive and it's emotionally better for everyone involved.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, this idea of using tech as well to assess a claim at the outset as well, particularly to try and filter out those which may have higher merits and lower merits. That's not to say that it takes away the human oversight, but, you know, it might be a quicker way of saying, actually, do we take this case on? Do we not take this case on? You know, is this one we need to look at again? It may help actually that filtration sort of idea as well. So
yeah, I mean, it takes us all the way back to where we started out, the FRC, you know, trying to understand at the outset where this case is actually going to sit. And I think it's an interesting area for us as a firm to think about how can we help solicitors make that assessment of what kind of investment do they, you know, ought they to be making in this case, by way of reference to a large cohort of other similar cases, or, you know, what you described earlier as kind of reference to data or data suit. You know, it's going to be very important to help solicitors manage their practice by providing them with as much data as we can.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And forecasting as well. You're looking ahead at what am I likely to get back from this case? So, because that's really, really tricky, because particularly where you've got cases which are pre-allocation, pre-assignment, you're sort of thinking, well, this is where I think it will go. But as I said at the top, judiciary has been inconsistent in that. And I think secondly as well, we're in a system where effectively, if there is a reallocation or a reassignment of a case, from a cost perspective, it's got retrospective implications. So if you start your case on the intermediate track complexity band 4, at some point there's a change in circumstances, the defendant applies, actually this needs to be reassigned, or the court says actually that needs to be reassigned, then suddenly you think, well, I've been planning this case on the fact it's intermediate track complexity band 4, now you're telling me it's complexity band 3. And that applies to all the work I've already done, which is, it's really tough from a certainty perspective, that.
And is there no escape from that? I mean, I saw somewhere, and it may have been on one of your blogs, that one of the important things to do, and I was thinking about this from our perspective, perhaps we could help, is just to make a contemporaneous note of why you've assessed the value of the claim at a certain level. So how does that assessment and the sort of reasonableness of your original assessment, how does that factor into the whole?
I think it would factor into the terms of the way the judiciary would likely look at it when there's an application. Because one of the things they said when they brought in the fixed cost reforms more broadly was that they didn't want to encourage that kind of satellite litigation. So I think, although the rules provide that you can make an application for reallocation and reassignment, I think firstly, are the judiciary likely want to entertain those? I suspect probably not, because they'll get inundated with them if they do start to do it. Secondly, in terms of the contemporaneous evidence, that's always going to be more powerful than anything which you're relying on in hindsight, because the whole point of essentially an exercise in costs is not to apply hindsight. You have to kind of look at what were the facts on the ground at that time. So whether that's the level of the success fee that you set it at, or whether that's looking at the value of the claim, that I think was more pertinent under the old regime, because under the old regime, if you had a case that was worth £25,000 or less, and it was one that fit the criteria for one of the PI portals, then in theory you have to submit it via that portal, and then effectively until it's allocated to the multi-track, you would be stuck with fixed costs of some description. So what you get is cases where a solicitor picks it up. There's a very experienced solicitor picks it up at the start, and maybe that's with your guys' help, as you mentioned there, looking at the injuries and looking at actually, the perspective side of longevity of those injuries and care and things like that. So you're looking at, actually, this is potentially valued higher than 25,000. So you proceed on the basis of a letter of claim. You don't submit it via the portal at all, and then you end up in a situation whereby it ultimately settles for a sum that's less than £25,000. And then the question comes, well, was it a case that was always worth less than 25,000, and therefore it should be fixed costs, it should have started on the portal? Or actually, was this a case where it's just changed over the course of the proceedings, and there might be actually less nefarious reasons for why it's settled at a lower sum? And what we've seen is the judiciary apply an approach whereby they will say, well, actually, you have to just look at it objectively at the outset, which is, if the evaluation is reasonably coming to the conclusion that the value of the claim was over £25,000, and it's not designed to be an overly stringent test, though it has to obviously be the claimant that proves the assessment was objectively reasonable. But so long as it was, then actually stands to reason that it's not fixed costs, actually it's time-basis costs. And we've seen a few decisions which have come that way. If you've got the contemporaneous evidence, that's ultimately what you're going to be drawing on. You're going to be looking at. So, you might look and go, well, what do the Judicial College guidelines say in this kind of bracket of injury? Has the claimant been off work? What kind of care have they received? What special damages might they have? So you might take all these factors together to do, a composite picture based on the information you have. And bear in mind that quantum assessment is generally undertaken before there's expert evidence. So you're not 100% necessarily certain on where the prognosis is going to go, but you might draw on your experience and go, actually, I've seen these kind of injuries before, that, this can cause longer term conditions. You might not know whether that's actually going to be the case until the expert evidence is borne out. But when you're making the decision to present the case to the defender, you've got to have some kind of logic behind it. And actually, that might still be objectively reasonable logic. So it's trying to kind of like weigh all of those bits and pieces up and hoping that they kind of stack up. But in the new fixed cost regime, it's a little bit different because you obviously now, if you had a case that was, so it's still helpful, because if you reasonably value a case over £25,000, then you might get fixed recoverable costs instead of portal costs. But the game sort of changed because before you were doing that exercise because it was fixed costs or time costs, whereas now it's kind of like fixed costs or more fixed costs.
What is the landmark cost decision that you feel we're really needing at the moment?
The decision that we need, and I think it's what we've talked about before quite clearly, some kind of buying authority on the medical agency point, although it's a very discrete point because it doesn't affect every firm of solicitors. But I think that would be really, really helpful just because it's so pervasive. It comes up so often. I think that's probably the big one right now. It's probably not going to be the big one in the next 3 or 4 years because things are just moving at such a pace. And it's not a case as such, but I think we do need clarity on the lower value clinical negligence claims. That's those clinical negligence claims which settle with a value of less than £25,000. And now, so that's not a landmark decision. It will be a significant announcement and will have significant ramifications when that clarity comes, because where we are right now is, we're waiting for the government to say what they want to do with it. Will they move forward with it? Will they just, leave it away? I think it's most likely that by the time we come to October, when this podcast is likely to be released, that we might have some movement on that. I think it tells a compelling story that this hasn't gone away, but exactly how that's going to be implemented remains to be seen because we've still only got the proposals. But I've said this whenever I talked about it, it will be, on the face of it, one of the most restrictive cost regimes we've ever seen if the proposals come in as they are currently proposed. Because, of course, between proposals and implementation, it could change. And I think that is a massive thing to keep an eye on because, if you start eroding, it's what we talked about before, if you start eroding access to justice on clinical negligence claims, but the actual instances of negligence don't decrease, then it is a complete failure. And it's going to be really interesting to watch that space, see how firms respond to it, see whether actually we see an improvement in patient safety, and just see how the whole thing pieces together because there's obviously a lot of uncertainty. And I think between medical agencies and the clinical negligence fixed cost reforms, I'd say they're the two questions that I get asked most commonly. But if in the meantime Leeds can win the Premier League or the Champions League, everything else doesn't matter.
Well, that's a dramatic and appropriate place to finish, Sean. This was absolutely fantastic. I knew it was going to be interesting. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. It's been great.
No, thank you, Adam. Thanks for the time as well. Much appreciated.